Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
In this bonus episode, I'm the person being interviewed. The interviewer is Amy Walsh of the Nettle Witch MD on Substack. The subject, so-called invasive plants. In our conversation, we dive into many of the basic critiques of this common but highly dubious narrative. We cover much of what the science says and doesn't say, and we also discuss what cultural beliefs and prejudices feed the narrative. If you appreciate this crossover episode, please subscribe to Amy's Substack at thenettlewitchmd.substack.com, linked below in the description. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today, I am chatting with Kollibri terre Sonnenblume, and he is a writer, photographer, tree hugger, animal lover, and sometimes organic farmer. He has published several books on natural ecology, human culture, and their intersections, and is currently co-authoring a new book with wild tender and botanist Nikki Hill entitled Don't Blame the Messenger, a critique of the invasive plant narrative. And that is really why I wanted to chat with him today. As I was researching my last Hawthorne article, I saw some publications from Washington State about really aggressive management of hawthorn from Europe with herbicides, and I've been trying to learn more about whether using herbicides for invasive species is appropriate, just because, I don't know, my intuition tells me that it's not. And I've read some great stuff by him, so I wanted to learn more about the topic, and hopefully you guys are interested in learning more too. So we'll kind of start just way at the beginning, Kollibri, and just kind of start with what are invasive species and why are they considered a problem?
Right. Well, first, thanks very much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate it. I'm just getting into the winter writing routine because I don't do much writing in the summer. This is the winter that Nick and I hope to finish our book, so this is a nice warm-up for me to get back into these subjects again. I became interested in the topic of so-called invasive plants because I became aware of how common herbicide use was in trying to manage them or control them. And I was already into organic farming before that. And before that, had already been into eating organic food. And so I was very concerned to be like, okay, why? Here's another reason why these toxins are being put into the environment, and is it justified, you know? And I have a very high bar for what would constitute justifiable use of herbicides, which is basically never. So this was an interesting topic for me to get into. So if you want to define what an invasive species is, this is actually very tricky. This is the first thing I looked at. So first of all, colloquially, people will just talk about like, oh, I planted this thing in my garden and now it's growing everywhere and it's taking over and it's invasive. And in that sense of it, that's just a way of saying, oh, this plant is thriving without much care and is disrupting the plans that I have for my space or whatever. So if that was the only way that we were using the word invasive, I don't think it would really matter, because that would just be a way of being like, oh, this plant annoys me. Well, okay, that's your issue. You can work that out between you and the plant. But what's been happening is that invasive, the topic of invasive, and we'll just go to invasive plants. Invasive plants, it's become a matter of policy for governments to try to manage these plants, and also many environmental or conservation organizations have also started to look at them, and a lot of restoration projects have really focused on them too. And so they have had their own definitions. And for example, I'm gonna read a couple things that I had up here for you already. So like the U.S. federal government describes an invasive species as being an invasive species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm to human health. The United Nations Environmental Program says that they're an introduced species that becomes established in a new environment, then proliferate and spread in ways that are destructive to human interests and natural systems. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature says animals, plants, or other organisms that are introduced by humans, either intentionally or accidentally, into places outside of their natural range, negatively impacting native biodiversity, ecosystem services, or human economy and well-being. So the first thing that kind of stood out with these kinds of definitions for me is that although a lot of people, especially environmentally and ecologically minded people, tend to think of invasive species as being primarily an environmental or conservation issue, for these policymakers, a lot of times they're looking at economic issues first, right? So the federal government is concerned about invasive plants in terms of how are they affecting agriculture, for example, or recreation. And that's a different concern than, oh, what we're concerned about is native plants, native ecosystems, etc. Like that's not actually at the top of their list. So it's interesting to note too that the federal government got involved in the topic of invasive species in the late 90s during the Clinton administration. He created a council to look into the topic and to make recommendations. And sitting on this council were a few environmentalists or invasion biology scientists, but also Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and several defense firms, which is really kind of strange. But I guess that the arms industry gets to have their fingers in every pie, no matter what the topic is in our government. So from the beginning, at the federal level, defining what an invasive plant is, and more importantly, what to do about it, was being defined in part by industries like Dow and Monsanto, who had an interest in selling herbicides as the solution to them. So this was not like a pure scientific discussion at the policy level, from the beginning, right? So the feds really they really set the tone there. And so then in the years that followed into the early 2000s, states, cities, counties all sort of adopted similar language. And we're like, oh, this is this big problem. We have to do something about this. Um, so then we'll go over to the science for a moment and be like, okay, so is there a scientific definition of what an invasive species is? And the short answer to that is no, there's not. So if you get into the invasion biology literature, they have different ideas, right? So they'll describe an invasive species as a species that successfully establishes itself in a new place, such a species that establishes and has impact, or such a species whose impact is negative. So there are some definitions that are just like any old new plant that shows up is invasive. There's other definitions that are like, well, it has to have an impact. And then there's other definitions that are like, well, it has to have a negative impact, right? And negative impact is really where I think most people's concerns are. And so that then brings us around to the topic of what constitutes negative impact, what constitutes harm. That's where the whole discussion becomes more complicated and nuanced. So what does constitute harm? So I guess the only other thing I would say is that in the by picking this word invasive, the discussion is very clearly being steered in a particular direction right from the beginning, because this word invasive has negative connotations right off the bat. So within the field of invasion biology, there have been scientists who have said, well, we can use this word in a purely descriptive way that doesn't have any negative connotations. And can't we just use it that way? And then other scientists have pushed back and said, who are you kidding? Of course not. Like this is a completely, this is a loaded emotive word, and it doesn't really have a place in our science. And so the debate within invasion biology as to whether even use the word invasive, uh, that's a debate that's gone on over time. And at this point, the people who are saying we really need to come up with different ways of talking about these things and different terminology, those people, I wouldn't say they're winning yet, but that side's becoming more and more vocal, and I think that eventually they're gonna push it in a direction where they're gonna just drop the use of that word because it's just so loaded, right from the beginning. Like you hear it and you're like, oh, that's a bad thing. Like, wait a minute, there's actually a big discussion to have here, but the discussion is sort of ended immediately just by using that word. I'll pause there and see what you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, those different definitions that you bring, from the federal government and the UN in particular. Like it jumped out right away how human-centric those
Right,
definitions were, how economic they were as opposed to ecological. And like, that's a very different problem that you're solving if you're solving for this plant is costing me money because it's interfering with the production of X versus this plant is disturbing a balance, and the way you solve those problems looks really different as well.
right,
But it seems like the same solution is being applied to both of them right now, from what I understand. So,
right. I mean, the basic idea is, the basic idea is that um, we're going to classify a species as being bad or destructive, just across the board. So as soon as this particular species shows up somewhere, oh, that's a problem. Oh, we have to do something about it. Oh, we have to get rid of it. And in the minds of some people, that issue is so dire that it's important to get rid of that plant by whatever means necessary, hence herbicides, right? Um, um, I- there's a lot of debate in invasion biology about a lot of different topics, but one topic that there's not much debate about at all is that we're not going to win that fight. Uh, they're here. Like they've spread, they've established the new plants that have entered new areas, and that's plants from the old world entering the new world, and vice versa, plants from the new world entering the old world. They've established in places where they're at home, and they're just there now. We can't get rid of them. This is pretty much agreed on. And so then at that point, then we should be having a discussion of like, okay, so how do we learn to live with these and changing our attitudes could certainly be part of it, but also looking at what actually is going on the ground, right? So the reason I mentioned that the part about naming an entire species bad is that what that does is ignore the context of a particular area, right? So I would say that there's no such thing as a bad plant, period. They're just plants that in a particular place at a particular time, particular people might not like for particular reasons, right? So that's a lot of particulars, and I feel like that's too many to just say, "Oh, this plant's bad." It's like, well, no, it depends on what you want, and what you're going for in a certain area, and a plant you can call, say, kudzu an invasive species and say, "Oh, that species is just it's just bad." But then, well, no, are you in the Pacific Northwest? Is that where you're at, or
I'm in the Midwest.
oh, you're in the Midwest? Okay, do you have kudzu there or
We don't really. I feel like the
right?
big invasive species people complain about here are buckthorn is probably the
Right.
biggest one, garlic mustard, Tartarian honeysuckle. Those are kind of the.
Right, right. And I used to be in the Pacific Northwest. Kudzu was absent, there, right? Um, well, so that plant isn't universally invasive or whatever you want to call it because it's only likes particular conditions. There's only particular places where it's going to be able to thrive in the first place, So in the Pacific Northwest, blackberries were a plant that a lot of people wrangled with for various reasons. I'm in New Mexico currently, and the only way to get a blackberry plant to grow here is to irrigate it, right? So the plant, it's not these are not villains that you can just sort of parachute into a place and they're going to take over no matter what. So first of all, there's that, you know. Um, uh, then we have to look at, I mean, what what constitutes harm? That's what's really difficult, because if we look at where most of these plants are appearing, um, they're appearing someplace where a disturbance got made already, right? And this is another place in invasion biology where there's widespread agreement that an introduced plant is not able, in most cases, to establish itself in a new area without a disturbance. So if you have an intact or fairly intact ecosystem, you can't just drop seeds in there from a plant that's from somewhere else and then and expect it to do well, you know, or you know, to do badly, depending on how you're looking at it, right? So a disturbance is usually is almost always required, right? So in that sense, so like what we have is like common disturbances are like roads, right? With a cut a road through an area, right? Agriculture is the single, if you want to talk about habitat destruction, agriculture is the single largest reason for habitat destruction in the world today. That's the biggest reason why you're gonna, you know, drain a wetland or cut down a forest or whatever it is that you're going to do, right? So you make a disturbance like that, and what you do is you have just now made a space for these new species to come in, right? In that sense, what they are is they're opportunists, right? And so the reason that the book that Nikki and I are working on is called "Don't Blame the Messenger" is because it's because rather than viewing the plants themselves as being a problem, what we're seeing is that generally what they are is they're a symptom of something else that happened, right? Right. In the invasion biology literature, there's a famous metaphor that uh, invasive plants are not drivers of change; they're passengers, right? So something comes into an environment and changes it, and then that makes an opening where these plants are able to establish, right? So the presence of these plants is just showing us something about the history of of that piece of land, right? So in many cases, our disturbances are having such a profound effect on a site that we've now made that site inhospitable to what was there before. But it's very hospitable to this other plant that's now appeared. A lot of plants that are on the bad list um, are plants that, like here in the New World, are plants that in the old world spent centuries or in some cases millennia adapting to the kinds of disturbances that we have, right? So agricultural weeds are a really common example of that. There's a lot of plants that have adapted to agriculture, to us tilling the land, you know, over and over again, right? To the different disturbances that are involved with agriculture, including um, disrupting water flows, setting up irrigation systems, even fences, you know, fence rows are a particular kind of setting that encourages or discourages certain kinds of plants. And roadsides are a big one, and roads are a big part of agriculture, of course, right? So there are plants that have adapted to these circumstances. Then when we make those same kinds of disturbances here, they're like, oh, hey, thanks, I'm right at home here, you know? And I like to use this phrase "at home" because I feel like if we're looking at a space, right, at a site, and we're like, okay, look at the mix of plants that are here. There's some natives, there's some introduced, like what's going on here? If we want to understand what's going on there, I think uh, the better question to ask, rather than saying, where is this plant from? The better question to ask is, where is this plant at home? So what are the conditions that it likes? What are the kinds of places that it's become adapted to? And that will tell you why it is that it's thriving there, right? So if for whatever reason you feel like you want to get rid of that plant, now you know about the underlying conditions that are existing, right? That are encouraging that plant, and that might also be discouraging what it is that you wanted there before. Um, there's the whole issue, of course, as to whether it is a problem for plants to be moving around, and we can get into that, but I'll pause here for a second.
Yeah, I think a couple of things kind of come to mind with what you're saying. One is kind of the comparison between invasive plants and native plants that aggressively grow in disturbance. So, like around me, it's like sumac or box elder
Right.
are plants that will really kind of take over in after a disturbed ecosystem. And so um, you find that really people's strategies for managing them is very similar as far as like aggressive removal, herbicide, those kind of things. Um, and that really then it ends up that the solution becomes just ongoing human management to maintain this balance as we like it, which is kind of an interesting thing because once you've started that, it kind of becomes a perpetual project, I think. The other thing that really jumped out at me was kind of what you were saying about how like so how you can kind of see the story of a disturbance almost in the plants that end up in a place. I remember I was taking a foraging class and I was fascinated because the teacher was taking us through this area and the only native spring ephemerals that were still there were trout lilies. And so like from that story, just that was the only plant that you were seeing there, you could tell that this woodland had been used as pasture because that's how the cattle like that
Right.
the trout lily is the only plant that was kind of strong enough to kind of continue to grow in spite of cattle grazing. And I just found that to be such an amazing idea that you can be so attuned to like this is what's supposed to be here supposed to, but like, you know, this is what has historically been here. And I noticed the absence of these things. So this must have been what happened here. I just find that fascinating that we can become keen enough observers to really know those stories if we know how to look at it. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like the I mean Nikki likes to say the plants don't lie, you know? If the
I'm
plant is
imagining
there,
like a Shakira song of the plants don't lie. But anyway, sorry.
right. And if the plant is there, it's telling you something, right? You know? Um, because different plants, some plants want particular things in the soil. Some of them want what we would call rich soil, or what we would call depleted soil. Some they want to be on the edge of a woodland. Some want to be in full sun. Some want, I mean, all of these things, they're just like that, right? So if you're seeing a plant somewhere, it's telling you something about what's going on there. And you had made the point earlier there. I really appreciate that. Uh, there also are native plants which take over or are aggressive or whatever, right? I'm here in New Mexico near the Gila River, and I'm on a part of the Gila River that's far enough upstream that it's before it hits any dams, right? There's a little bit of irrigation diversion around here, but not much. So it's close to a wild stream, to a wild river here, meaning that it still has cycles of flooding in the spring, right? So once you dam a river, now any of the cycles that would have happened with seasonal flooding no longer occur in the same way, because we're now controlling that flow, right? So there was a major flood event here a couple of years ago that was rather historic. And this year, walking around, I was noticing these big rocky bars along the river that are just jam-packed full of cottonwood seedlings, right? And so the Fremont cottonwood is a native species here. And in order for it to reproduce well, it needs a spring flooding event. Its seeds are you've probably seen cottonwood seedlings in the spring. They're like light and fluffy. They can cover the ground like snow in some cases, right? So those seeds are very short-lived, only a few weeks it is that they can live, right? They don't contain an endosperm so if you look at like a bean seed or a corn seed or something like that, like a big chunk of that seed is the endosperm, which is a big um, uh, it's food, right? For the plant to grow, right? So that's for its initial like, let me send down a root, send up a sprout, and then I'll start to photosynthesize and that initial the endosperm is the first bit of food that gets the seedling going, right? Willow seed, I mean, the cottonwood seeds don't have the endosperm. However, they can photosynthesize. They're a seed which is able to photosynthesize, right? So they depend on the spring floods to take and wash them up onto appropriate soil, like right close to the water, but not in the water, but close to it, right? Like sandy, rocky is what they like. And then if they land in the proper place, they'll germinate within 24 hours, right? Boom, And so there was some prime condition that happened in the last year or two here because there's places where there's like literally hundreds of seedlings and just like 30 40 square feet or whatever. I mean they're just jammed in there, right? So they took over, right, they they did in these areas. They have taken over, right? Like it's literally the only thing that's growing there in some of these places, right? A monotypic stand, you could call it, right? And so, so the behavior, and then of course, and that was a disturbance, right? That was a disturbance that happened, which is the flood. So first of all, we should keep in mind that a disturbance is not we use it in a negative sense, but it is actually just a disturbance just means that there's been a change, right? And so a disturbance can be a fire, it can be a flood, it can be a road or whatever like that. From the viewpoint of nature's kind of agnostic about it in that sense. Nature's just like, oh, something changed. What will grow here? Well, let me make that grow here now, right? And that's just kind of how it is. We can choose to look at disturbances as negative, and I think that we should, in terms of like a clear cut or a mine or whatever. I mean, I think that's completely reasonable that we should call certain kinds of disturbances negative. But a disturbance is just something that happens. And the fact that every region is going to have its plants that like disturbances, that grow very quickly after a disturbance, that take over or whatever, right? And so, um, in that way, because people will attribute traits to invasive plants. They'll say, oh, they spread quickly. Oh, they take over. Oh, they do this and that. It's like, well, okay, but native plants do as well. So that's not actually a characteristic that's unique to these introduced plants. And so this is a part that invasion biology is really grappling with right now, is that you can't you can't come up with a list of traits that would identify what an invasive plant is. So if you or I were to like get dropped off in some part of the world where we've never been and we're completely unfamiliar with the plants, but it's a mix of native plants and introduced plants, we would have no idea which are which. We would have no idea which are which. And a biologist or a botanist who's been trained, in plants, right? And who's really professional, they can't go there with a clipboard and be like, okay, I don't recognize anything here, but if I look at their traits, I'll be able to tell which is native and which is introduced. No, that's impossible because there aren't actually traits that quote unquote invasive plants have that native plants don't. And I feel like this is a point that doesn't get much attention at all, and that we really need to reflect on some more.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right. I hadn't really thought about that like that you going somewhere where you hadn't already been told which plants are good and which plants are bad. That
Yeah.
that you wouldn't know that, because if I didn't know these plants, like I wouldn't be able to tell, oh, this buckthorn is growing prolifically because it's invasive, because I could look at the sumac, which is doing the exact same thing pretty much. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the buckthorn is not growing enthusiastically because it's invasive. The buckthorn is growing enthusiastically because the conditions exist there that allow it to grow enthusiastically. And what are those conditions, and how did they come about? And the only reason those questions are important is just in terms of restoration,
Mhm.
for example, and that's an interesting subject too, restoration and uh what are reasons to do it? What are reasons not to bother? If it is something to do, what's the baseline that you're picking? How are you figuring out what that baseline was? It all becomes really kind of difficult because the whole introduced thing is just based on a calendar date, basically, right? So we can say 1492 for the New World. But in California, I think the official date is like 1763 or something like this. I think that's when the date of the first Spanish mission in Southern California or something like that, So really, there wasn't, apparently anything being introduced before then, But we don't know what those conditions were. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but we don't know. Figuring out exactly what those conditions were is really, really tricky, right? Um, do you know much about the whole beaver thing and what happened with beavers in this? Right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Beavers are so fascinating. Their whole,
Yeah, no, it's incredibly fascinating. And like the whole of the United States, but maybe especially the arid West, looked so much different when there were beavers, right? Like um in the American Southwest, there's these arroyos, sometimes called washes, right? So there are these dry river or stream beds that will have sudden flash floods come through them, and they usually have rather steep sides and this and that. And we just think of that as being characteristic of what the American Southwest is like. As it turns out, that's not actually true. Like there were beavers in the Southwest too. I've personally seen beavers happily living in a canyon in Arizona. We don't think about beavers in Arizona, but they were there, right? They were all over Nevada, they were all over California, they were all over Oregon, all of these places, completely changing what the landscape was like, how the water was on the landscape, the level of the water table, therefore the vegetation that was there, therefore the animals that were there. I mean, we don't even know what it looked like. We don't have photographs. We have very few descriptions, and yet this really key element of what did it all look like when the beaver was there? We're not even considering it most of the time. And there's some really great people in the world who are doing beaver restoration now, and who are doing beaver analog projects as well. That even if they don't attract beavers back, are attempting to restore streams to the state they would be in if beavers were there working on them. Um, those are some really great, fun people, by the way, who are out there doing beaver stuff. If you have a chance to go out and help build a beaver dam analog, sometime I really highly recommend it. You get to get in the water and you're playing with mud and sticks, and it's great, right? So that's really it's really knowing what we're even going for is really difficult. So we need to be humble about that. Um, Probably a better way to think about it is like, well, what do we want to manage a particular place for? Um, you can come up with any different sets of reasons or rationales for a different area, but what is it that you want to manage it for? And then to work towards that goal with the understanding that it's impossible to go back in time, that it actually can't be restored to exactly however it was. Uh, so then coming up with a realistic goal.
yeah. Yeah. I like that. um, that more strategic way of looking, what are we managing this for? And I think that it really is a very traditional way of doing land management, of like that indigenous folks here and in Europe had a goal, and that goal sometimes was food production, sometimes was maintaining biodiversity, but like that, and often both of those at the same time where it was possible, of course, um, that, uh, yeah, that we can definitely be positive actors for the ecosystem if we have the knowledge of kind of where we're trying to take things and are observing for unintended consequences of our actions and things like that. Yeah,
We're a keystone species is
definitely.
one way to look at it, right? And you know, we've been affecting landscapes at a landscape level, managing them at a landscape level um, since we got fire, really, right? So that's a very long time. That's hundreds of thousands of years, right? There's evidence of intentional fire for landscape management in Europe going back a couple 100,000 years, I think. I mean, a very long time, and then, yeah, here in the Americas, well, in the Great Plains, there was the people set fires there intentionally in order to expand prairie habitat and to limit the forest habit, limit the forests, and this was in part because then what you're doing is making bison habitat, right? So you want to encourage bison because that's such an important part of your diet and your culture. And so you're using fire to keep the trees at bay and keep the prairie there. Because all these landscapes are every ecosystem is constantly changing, all the time, Some of it's due to climatic, climatic shifts that happen over time, right? We have ice ages that come and go. Within interglacial periods like the one we're in, we have different variations in temperature and in how much water, is available, all of that. And so ecosystems are always responding to these changes. And so one common thing that can happen is that a grassland, under right conditions, a grassland might slowly be taken over by forest over time, right? And so but with fire, you can hold the trees back and keep the grassland or expand the grassland because the bison had a much wider range at one time. I mean, Buffalo, New York is called Buffalo, New York for a reason because that's how far east they were. It was crazy, right? They actually were just they were on the west side of the Rockies to some degree as well in a few areas, although that's rather limited, but it was a huge, huge range, And in California, it was traditional to set fires to tend the oak groves there, right? So you have oak woodland, right? So what that is widely spaced mature oaks on grassland, right? It's not a dense forest with a closed canopy. And so over time, fir trees especially will, encroach into the oak woodland and would turn it into a mixed woodland at one time. So eventually, and so the fires were set to keep to keep the firs down and keep it preserved as an oak woodland. And if you're setting small fires on a regular basis, those are not going to harm mature oak trees. They're just not. They're going to be completely fine. Another result of those fires was that have you ever collected acorns yourself? Have you ever?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you noticed how some of them will have a hole in them?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So there's an insect that it's some kind of weevil, I think, that will lay its eggs in the acorns when they're small and immature and green, and then as the acorn matures, the eggs will hatch, and then the larvae will eat the nut meat on the inside, and then it will make a hole and exit. So what you're seeing is an exit hole, right? Then that larvae will then go into the soil and live in the top layers of the soil for 1 or 2 years before becoming an adult and going up into the tree and starting the whole process over again. So if you're having regular fires, what you're doing is you're limiting that population that's growing in that's living in that upper layer, right? You're not letting them get out of control, right? Like there'll always be a few, but they won't come to dominate, right? So then you'll get more nuts, right? And then of course keeping an area open like that means that things like berry bushes and other food plants that prefer the sun will continue to thrive. So you need to be careful about your timing with these things, of course, Um, but that's how it's done. And then on the East Coast, more and more study is showing that the native forests there have higher densities of food plants, including lots of different kinds of nut trees, near where settlements were and along trading routes, And so we can see that different species were encouraged and different species were also moved around too. So the ranges of plants, this has happened all over the world, that the ranges of plants have been extended by our choices that we've made before agriculture even, right? I mean, apples, have moved out of their area from where they originally were. In the United States, we can see, as I said, on the East Coast, we can see the, hickory and a lot of these trees, their range was expanded because of human involvement. In the West, it's a lot of the root crops whose range was expanded. So it makes perfect. I mean, we've always been a species who works with plants and encourages some plants and discourages others, right? So we don't have a hands-off relationship, and it's I don't think it's helpful to try to suggest that we should either, right? There's kind of a fortress conservationism that can happen where it's like, okay, we're going to keep this place wild and healthy by just simply saying, okay, everybody out, nobody can go in. And I think that historically this was very useful. The Wilderness Act of the 30s that basically set some land aside and said, okay, everybody out. Look, we're making too much of a mess, everybody out. That was good that put on the brakes and that saved some places that are now, didn't get any further destruction since then. But now more and more people are looking at it and be like, well, now wait a minute. Human beings were parts of these ecosystems. Like these ecosystems looked like they did when Europeans arrived because of human involvement, right? So, so how do we get back to a healthy relationship again with how we're interacting with the plant world and what we're encouraging and what we're discouraging? And to bring it back to invasives, using that word and then going down that road of like, oh my gosh, we just have to get rid of this thing because of what it is, no matter what. That's not an approach to a healthy relationship, and I don't see that it leading there. I see it leading us further away from there. So this is why it's harmful on a practical level, is because it's like, wow, okay, we're really disconnected from nature as it is. Now we're being given this label, which is kind of a weapon, and I don't see this narrative about invasive plants leading us in the right direction at all.
Yeah, it's kind of like Robin Wall Kimmerer's research on sweetgrass about how
Right.
the plants really thrive, and it doesn't matter how you take the plant, like whether you uproot it or you just pull the leaves, but all of those plants are healthier than if you just leave them alone
Right.
to do their own thing.
Right, because they've adapted to us,
Mhm.
as well, right?
Yeah.
And some of these plants, like the root crops, there's root crops in the American West that reproduce because they make a bulb, and then they'll make little bulblets around the bulb. So you pull the plant out, you take the big bulb to eat, then the little bulblets are left, or you can scatter them around, and now they make the new plants, right?
Mm.
And without that kind of disturbance, the plant actually doesn't do as well, right? And bears would have been doing this before, right? And other animals. So these plants adapted first to bears and then to us, with this. And so in that sense, it's a relationship that we have some responsibility in that we're shirking now at this point.
Yeah, I think a lot of the other questions I was going to ask you, we've probably kind of skirted around, but I'll probably still ask quite a few of them
Yeah, yeah, throw it out.
just because I think that they're really a part of the conversation that kind of the community at large is hearing and having about
Right.
invasives. So, um, how how are experts currently recommending that we solve the problem of invasive species, kind of as we've defined it anyway so far?
Right, right. I mean, among experts, if we're gonna, I mean that's a good question because as experts, land management people in
Mm.
government and nonprofits, or as experts, people in the field of invasion biology, or
Yeah, I guess I would say maybe like, yeah, I think probably I would say maybe more of the land management folks, just because I think they're the ones who are driving the decisions kind of at the larger um, municipality, state, federal levels. It
right,
seems like to me most of the time anyway.
right, right, right. Well, to deal with a plant that you don't want in a place, I would first of all mention that there's three broad categories of how you can deal with something, right? And that is mechanical, biological, and chemical, right? So mechanical is a wide range of things from I'm going out there and I'm just pulling this thing up myself personally, right? Or coming in with a bulldozer, right? And just like wiping out a whole area, like that. Like that's mechanical, right? So mechanical um at the most manual level, mechanical is great because you really can focus on just getting rid of the thing that you want to get rid of, right? If you're just out there as a crew, with a shovel or whatever, right? A bulldozer is obviously much less selective, right? But the thing about mechanical disturbances is that you're just moving things around basically is what you're doing, right? As opposed to chemical, where you're now dumping things there um, that are now maybe persisting in the soil, that are maybe getting into the water, that are maybe harmful to animals or insects. That a lot of chemicals, of course, are not selective. They're not. There's no such thing as a as a invasive only herbicide, right? There's a plant killer is a plant killer, right? And uh, when spraying if you're like using spray, for example, right, to in an area, I was shocked to learn, and I dug into it and quite a bit to make sure that what I was reading wasn't wrong. But when spraying is done, the amount of spray that hits the target only, it is between 1 and 10%.
Oh, wow.
More often towards the lower end of that, right? So if you're spraying, the vast majority of the spray is not hitting your target and it's just going out into the environment at large, right? This is really shocking for me to learn. I was like, really? It's that? And no, it really is that bad. It was that was yeah. I was really surprised to hear that, and different herbicides persist for longer, take longer to break down, et cetera, et cetera, are more or less worse for human health, I mean, none of them are, I mean, there's no such thing as a good pesticide, I mean, in that sense, right? There's always going to be collateral damage, from those things. And the other method I'll just mention briefly was the biological. So biological is where like an example of biological is like you've probably heard of St. John's wort. Yeah, Hypericum perforatum. Right, it's a medicinal plant. It likes disturbed places, waste places. It's especially fond of roadsides, it likes what we would call poor soil, right? So a pasture that's been overgrazed becomes a good habitat for for St. John's wort. So St. John's wort had become extremely prevalent in California due to ranching, due to livestock, cows and sheep, in the first part of the 20th century, and the plant had become very common. And it was considered a negative plant, not for any ecological reason, but because it was believed that it caused phototoxicity in sheep,
Mm.
right? So that sheep who eat this are now more sensitive to the sun and can become injured, or sickened in this way, right? And so it was decided they need to get rid of this. They found a beetle from the old world that really likes St. John's wort, and they released it en masse in an organized way in California in the 40s, 48, maybe something like that, right? And within a couple of decades, he managed to knock down the population of St. John's wort by like 90 some percent or something like that, right? So that's probably the best story you're going to hear about biological control, because a lot of times what happens is you introduce this insect, for example, and oh, but it also likes these other native plants here that are closely related. Oops, or whatever, right? Or I mean that's very common, or becomes quote invasive now on its own terms, or whatever, right? Those are that's another method, is biological control, and it's usually recommended against at this point because it's just too tricky to
So many
do.
unintended
But
consequences. Yeah.
there's all sorts of unintended. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. It's interesting, just as a quick side note, that there's a plaque, a bronze plaque, celebrating the release of this insect, and it's got the date and the year and everything on it at this county agricultural office in Humboldt County, near the town of Eureka, that I saw one day. I was just like, oh wow, this is it. Like they're still proud of it. There's this ancient plaque that's there. Like a historical marker or something, or like the kind of plaque you'd see on like a statue of a heroic general or something. It's pretty funny. But yeah, I think the chemical issues is that's just a really big issue, like we know that we're making the environment more and more toxic for various for all the other creatures who live there at this point. We know that we're affecting insect populations, we know, I mean, the whole chemical industry came out of the war industry in the first place as well, out of the people making gases for World War I, and Monsanto was the one who was putting together Agent Orange, for use in Vietnam, and there's still people being born with birth defects there to this day from the Agent Orange, uh, to say nothing of the many U.S. soldiers who were sickened by it, who were over there as part of applying it, and um, and when it comes to get back to your question, then how is it that land managers are dealing with invasive plants? Primarily through chemical methods, not biological methods or mechanical methods. Primarily through chemical ones, right? Uh, Part of this is financial. Grants that are given for restoration will contain a line item for use of herbicides, but will not contain one for mechanical removal, or will contain one it's not nearly adequate to the job. So it's not being funded. It's cheaper, right? It's cheaper, right? So that that's there's a really great website that I really recommend you and any listener go look for. It's called Conservation Sense and Nonsense, and it's put together by someone who lives in California, who's been looking at these issues for the last few decades. She lives in the Bay Area, and she follows all these issues out there very closely. Like, oh, they want to, cut down all these eucalyptus trees, et cetera, et cetera. She's on top of it. She does really good research, gets into all the science, and can translate it into like normal speak for people. And she publicized the results of a survey that the California Invasive Plant Council had put out a few years ago, where they surveyed a whole bunch of land managers Some of them are private, some of them are with the state, government agencies, et cetera. And it's like, okay, what methods do you use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them use, I mean, the vast majority of them use chemicals, period. And then the vast majority of those use primarily, those chemicals. So we know this is true also just from what what these agencies will say, on their own is that that's what they're doing. So unfortunately, creating this, villain of the invasive plant and then trumpeting the dangers of it, how they're taking over and they're just, out competing all the natives, blah, blah, blah. Right now, what that's doing is just encouraging the use of chemicals in the environment. That's what it's doing. The more you play the sphere up, the more chemicals are getting sprayed. That's the reality that we're in right now. And so this is something for people to consider, even if they do think that invasive plants are some huge problem, which I don't think they are. But even if they do believe that, they really should be considering the fact that, like, by pushing this narrative, you are pushing the use of chemicals, which are hurting other things, including humans, if you don't care about other things except humans. And that this should really give people pause,
Um, all right. Sorry, I'm just kind of reviewing my questions to see
Oh, it's all good.
see
The
what
one
we've
thing I'll
addressed
mention,
and what we haven't addressed yet, because I love the way that this conversation has flowed. Um,
I'll throw in one more thing about the chemical use,
yeah.
which is that there are a number of species, an increasing number of species, who are, of course, developing resistance
Mm,
to herbicide use at this point. And so what that means is that more and stronger pesticides need to be used over time to kill them because they've gotten used to and are now adapting to what we've done to them, already. And
mm.
so using more seems like it just causes more problems in that sense too.
Yeah. Yeah, we've definitely run into that in medicine quite a bit as far as
Mm.
antibiotic resistance, and
Right? Right.
be
Yeah. Yeah.
nice if we could kind of have a little pattern recognition of those things. But uh,
Mm.
yeah. So one thing I was just remembering from something I think was probably one of the first things that you wrote that I read was that you were talking about the science of like how many native species have actually been threatened or endangered because of
Right.
invasive species. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Right. Right. No, this is a really good point. So the number of native species in the United States and Canada, who have gone extinct, due, solely to the presence of introduced plants is zero. There's not a single documented case of that ever happening, not even just within one US state, you know? Um, and this figure comes from an organization that's been tracking uh, basically biodiversity in the United States and Canada um, for over 50 years. And there's a gentleman there who has been doing who currently runs it. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. I can send it to you, but um, who's been doing surveys himself since 1969, the year I was born. And I was I had an email exchange with him, about this because his name always gets cited in these things. And yeah, he runs this massive, database basically, which takes in information from the county level on up from every county in the United States, all of the provinces, of Canada, and they've been looking at all of it very carefully, this whole time, and if it was going to show up anywhere, it'd be showing up there, and it hasn't. There's not, you know, there's there's definitely a perception of harm out there, but then how much real harm? That's the question, because as I said before, the biggest threat to native species and to native ecosystems is habitat destruction, right? by far, right? By far, that's the biggest threat, right? And so the after effects of perceived competition that occurs after that are much smaller if they're real, right? And competition um, is actually very difficult to identify and to quantify, right? So just because a species of plant was prevalent in an area at one time, and now this other species of plant is prevalent there in that area, that does not mean, oh, this new species outcompeted that old species. That's a correlation, but it's not a causation, if you know what I'm saying, right? So there are so many reasons why why the old plant didn't do well, and why the new plant did do well, that might have absolutely nothing to do with them competing with one another for any kind of resource or anything like that. So when I started to dig into uh, how do biologists define competition, and how do they attempt to identify it and to measure it? I was really surprised to be like, oh, wow, they're not really very good at this, and they know they're not very good at this. Right? Like so like they're once you get into the literature, they're pretty open about the fact that they're just making guesses, And so for example, if you're looking at, okay, you've got like a meadow, right? And it's got, 24 species in it or something like that, right? It's a mix of native and non-native plants, and you're trying to figure out how they're relating to each other and who's competing with whom or whatever, right? Well, the way to go about figuring that out that's most common right now is that what you would do is you would grow out every single one of those plants in pairs, right? So take that 24 plants and you're going to grow plant A with plant B, and then plant A with plant C, and then plant A with plant D. Okay, do you see how many this ends up being, right? So this ends up being several hundred pairings, right? Overall, right? that you're doing. And then you need a control too, right? So you need to just grow the plant by itself as well, or with multiples of itself to see, is competition with itself also having an effect? Because that's a thing, right? And so then you need to look at all that. And then where are you doing this? Are you doing this in a greenhouse? Are you doing this in an old field? Are the conditions in the greenhouse or the old field the same as the conditions of where? I mean, it's just like, wow, okay. I mean, if you want to just say, yes, for certain, A is outcompeting B, it's really, really hard to prove it. It's famously difficult to actually demonstrate that, right? And so, and they talk about how easy it is to have this false perception of, oh, this thing was here, now this thing is here. And I mean, they talk about that. They're aware of that as a bias in our perspective as people looking at landscapes, and they're trying to work that bias in and to get around it. And again, it was another one of these instances where getting into the science, I was astounded to be like, oh, wow, they they don't they're not proving this thing that seems like everyone is already just pretending as if it's proven, it's like, no, this is tricky, hold your horses, so that's been fascinating, to look at that. So I think that when we think about competition, we have our own ideas about what competition means, right? And we have our ideas about the role of competition in the world, which have an awful lot to do with the kind of society that we live in, right? Because we live in a very competitive society, right? The capitalist society is, has a lot to do with competition, at least at the level of workers pitted against, workers, right? At the level of capitalist owners, it's actually about eliminating competition and becoming a monopoly. That's your goal, right? It's just to eliminate, competition. But it's worth noting, and I'm not the only person who noted this, that when Darwin came up with the idea of with the ideas of the roles of competition and survival of the fittest and all this, this was being done in the cultural context of the Industrial Revolution in England, which was like this just horrific event that happened, right? This was the era of like child slave labor and in coal mines of people dying in their early 20s from black lung, like on a regular basis, of the whole pastoral countryside getting, torn up and turned into an industrial wasteland, and of the concentration of power and wealth, such as it really hadn't been seen before. And this was the cultural context that Darwin was in when he was coming up with these ideas about how nature works, right? And Darwin was undoubtedly a gifted and smart individual, and his stuff is totally worth looking at. But we need to look at how his ideas were colored by the environment that he was in. Also, when he was talking about survival of the fittest, he wasn't talking about competition between species. He was talking about competition within a species. He was talking about how a species improves itself and becomes more fit over time, by individuals within it that aren't as fit, not living to reproduce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he wasn't even talking about competition between species, right? So when we're looking at, we're like, oh, well, look, this plant came in and outcompeted this other one. That's survival of the fittest. It's like, well, that's not exactly what he was talking about. He was so the and all this is to say is that the invasive narrative is as you've seen me say in my writing a lot, including the new one that I just put out this week. There's a lot of cultural elements, a lot of things about our culture that make this story believable, or that make it sound right, regardless of what the science is, or regardless of how things might work beyond the reach of science, which is certainly also part of our world, right? And in the research we've been doing for this book, we came up with four major areas that we felt like were cultural elements that help prop up this narrative. And those are xenophobia, so the fear of the other, the idea that competition is the driving force in life, which I was just talking about, the agricultural worldview, which sorts plants into good plants and bad plants, crops and weeds. And then the idea that nature is a stable and an unchanging place. And so that any change that happens is an aberration or somehow is showing that something is wrong, right? That's a religious idea in particular, actually, going back to the Abrahamic religions of the whole world being created in 7 days and everything being put in its proper place, right? And so that when something leaves its proper place, something is wrong, right? So the idea that if we see a change happen, something went wrong, right? There's also that's happening. So I'll just pause there because that was a mouthful to give you those four cultural elements. But I think that this is really important for understanding the narrative and its popularity, is to look at these cultural elements in shaping the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, storytelling is another one of my hobbies. And so I think that
Right.
how these stories kind of shape our actions is really interesting. Like you could instead tell the story of the Wood Wide Web and how we direct resources toward the beings that need it and kind of shunt things where they need to go and communicate really well and exchange and reciprocity and all
Right.
this. Or you can tell the story of we're being invaded and we need to protect ourselves. And so it's interesting how those stories shape our actions. And I think that um, it comes to eventually be a story of where humans are always malign actors
Right.
ecological things, and that, as you were mentioning before, that sometimes people then just say, oh, the solution is to remove people from the environment, when really, like, yes, we need to make different choices and let go of our attachment to convenience and consumerism, but we can be very good influences if we choose to make different choices. But yeah, one other thing that what you were saying earlier reminded me of was that same foraging teacher I mentioned earlier. He was teaching about ecoculture, which he kind of
Mhm.
thinks of as kind of tending the wild for usable human products. But he was
Right.
talking about never let a good disturbance go to waste. And
Nice.
so I use that kind of within my own life when there's kind of
Mhm.
tumultuous stuff happening,
Mhm.
but also
Right.
kind of as my own land management strategy of when the moles are tearing up my prairie, that I have some seeds on hand to kind of
Right, right.
toss in there like that. But I think that that's kind of like the plant governing strategy for their lives too, of like, well, to me as a plant, it doesn't matter where this disturbance came from. I'm gonna take advantage of it to the extent that I can. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And this idea that we have this false idea that things don't move around, right? We know that they do, right? We know that the continents have drifted, and that animals that lived in one area or plants that lived in one area no longer do. They've gone extinct. I mean, there were redwoods in Europe at one point. Whatever, right? So we know that the world changes, and yet there's some level at which we don't know it. We haven't absorbed that, somehow culturally. And so the idea of a plant or an animal, expanding its range, moving from one place to another and making a new place home as well. It seems wrong to us, but when we look at the history of the world, that's just the opposite. Like, plants and animals are constantly moving, constantly adapting and changing their ranges. I mean, the ice ages, right? So we're in an ice age right now. We're in an interglacial ice age, in an interglacial period right now, right? And so the last glacial maximum was about 24,000 years ago, right? That was the area of like maximum ice. So, starting at around 24,000 years ago, that's when things started to slowly melt. The glacier started to recede, this or that, and by around 12,000 years ago, had pretty much receded to where they are now for what's called the Holocene, right? Or the Anthropocene, depending on what you want to call it, right? But what that means is that where you are in the Midwest, or where I am in New Mexico, or where a friend is in New England, or a friend is in the Pacific Northwest, is that the landscapes here, which we consider to be the native landscapes, are only started to come into being around 12,000 years ago. And they really only reached stages that we would consider recognizable to now around 6 or 8 thousand years ago, right? So geologically, that's just a blink, in time, right? So sometimes people will talk about, how, all these plants and the animals, they've been co-evolving together for millions of years. And it's like, well, they've been co-evolving in this area for the last 10 or 12,000. It's not that old. And what's more, that 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 the movement since the last melting of the ice has not changed, has not stopped yet. It's still ongoing, right? There are still on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, for example, species of trees which are still regaining ground that they lost last time the ice came down, right? Their range is still in motion right now, right? Pinyon and juniper woodland, across the west. Its range is still changing, right? So what constitutes the native range of something is not this static thing that we think of it as. We're like, oh, its native range is this. It's like, well, its native range as measured at a particular time falls roughly within those lines, but that native range is always changing, right? Currently a lot of things are moving north or further or further up in elevation because things are heating up, right? If things start to cool down, they'll move back down the mountains and they'll start to move back south. This is how it's always happened. And every time that the glaciers have covered North America and then gone back up, and even when the glaciers weren't there, of course, the climate was much different, the exact assemblage of plants that returns each time is not the same as it was the time before, right? So there are species that retreated last ice age, in the last time who were there before who didn't come back this time, right? And vice versa, right? So there's nothing written in stone about what should or shouldn't be living in a particular region in that sense, right? That's always going to be in flux. So that was just the point is that the fact that the world is always changing doesn't seem to have really penetrated our consciousness yet at a cultural level, right? We still tend to think of the world on some level as being like, oh, this is just how it is. Like there's a forest there, there's a river there, these plants live there. And it's like, well, they are now, but they haven't always. And more importantly, there's not any reason to think of that they should be in that sense, right? And so adaptation occurs, like the engine of evolution, which is adaptation, occurs when conditions change, right? As they're always changing. And those conditions are climate, localized disturbances, and the introductions of new species, whether they're animals or plants. And that's just how it goes. This is how the world is that it always changes. Now, has there been an introduction of species within at sort of a greater scale and within a shorter time frame due to colonization over the last 500 years? I think that's fair to say yes, right? But it's not unprecedented for changes this drastic to happen, just perhaps over a longer time change or something like that. Although there are also the events that have happened in history with massive volcanism, with comets, et cetera, where there have been, incredibly massive die-offs, and changes that have occurred and then recoveries, from those as well. So I think that, yeah, just I feel like I can't stress too much this point that we can't seem to get into our heads that change is just how nature works.
Yeah, I think that we kind of like the idea of kind of the static and that we are in control of things and like we're willing to sort of assume the responsibility for bad things that happen in order to continue to think that we are controlling things that we in fact have little to no control over. But yeah.
Right. And I think that in terms of colonization and all the changes that have happened since then, there's a phrase that was used by some elders in the and I hope I'm pronouncing the nation name right, Anishnaabe tribe. They're around
they're up in my
the
neck of
Great
the
Lakes
woods.
region. Oh, right. So there's really interesting paper. I can send it to you if you haven't read it already. There was someone from that community who went to school to get the letters after his name, right? And then came back to his community to study some of these issues, and then to like not only look at the plants and what's where and all that sort of thing, but also just to talk to people and be like, well, what are the attitudes? How are people looking at these things? How is, and like, an anthropological survey as well, right? And the phrase that I really valued that came out of there that they highlighted was this idea of invasive land ethics.
Mm.
I was like, okay, now this is interesting, isn't it? Right? So what can truly be said to be invasive is in these invasive land ethics, this different way of looking at land that came with colonization, right? Because within the tribe, there were, of course, different people having different ideas. This happens, right? So there's not a monolithic opinion within any group, right? But there was this idea of invasive land ethics as being what to focus on rather than calling plants invasive. And then there were also viewpoints that were like that viewed plants moving around as being a natural part of life, that such migrations occurred, and that these are their own people, these plant species, who are coming in. And so there's a responsibility of the human people to like get to know this other people who have moved in. Okay, who are you? What are you about? Like what is your story, right? So very different way of looking at it than the, oh, you don't belong here, you're out, kind of thing, which, for descendants of European colonists to be talking about, oh, you don't belong here because you're not from here. I mean, that's really rich, like really. I don't think I'll ever get over that one.
Yeah, I think that concept of invasive land ethics is really paradigm shifting, really like it's
Right.
like that is something that I think that you could really mobilize against and like do some amazing stuff as opposed to like hand pulling stalks of buckthorn.
Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
um, yeah. Yeah. Tyson Yunkaporta kind of talked about that within the Australian indigenous community as well, that when invasive plants come in, that there is sort of this almost like formalized ethics of meeting and getting to know the plant and finding out who they are, what they do, all those kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I've read some interesting stuff about uh different native indigenous people in Australia, and different there's been a number of papers and that have come out looking at that, and how um there's like, I can't remember what they call them down there, but there's like provincial groups whose job is to do land management stuff. They've been bringing indigenous people onto these crews, which okay, great, you're doing this now at least, right? And then they were then finding that the young indigenous people who were brought in these crews to be trained, that in some cases they were really having some problems because they're like, well, wait a minute, this training that we're getting from you and how to look at these plants and what to do about these plants really doesn't fit with what we've been told, by our elders, and when traditionally how we've been, raised to look at these things. And so they were really finding, there was a dissonance there, for them. And so this one paper was really interesting because it was talking about that dissonance and then how they were going about trying to, to address it. And, long story short, the best thing to do was to give leadership of these crews over to the indigenous people.
Inconceivable.
Right. Right. You know. Yeah.
Well, gosh, I think that you have answered kind of all the questions that I had, and then more. I love the flow of this conversation. It was really fun. Is there
Mhm.
anything else that you, I don't know, want to relay to the public about kind of the decisions that they might make with land that they have for themselves or a beloved place like a park, that, or any other message that you just want that you wish more people knew as far as kind of their approach to invasive species?
Right. I mean, I think that what's really important is to always look at uh any particular site you're looking at, to look at the plants within that context and then the historical context that's going on, and understanding, why those plants are there and what it is that they're doing, right? Because after a disturbance happens of any kind, the plants that come into to a disturbance are there to do different jobs, we could say, right? They're there to hold down the soil so that it doesn't just erode away, right? They're there to a lot of times when it's in succession, what happens is that you have a flush of annuals for the first few years, right? Those are the ones that they don't need much time to grow. They produce a lot of seeds. They can, quickly cover the ground, to keep it from washing away. They then make room for the next wave of plants to come in, which will be perennials, right? You know, just perennial forbs, and then you start to get shrubs, bushes. Eventually, you'll get trees if trees are the kinds of things that are gonna that were there pre-disturbance, etc. And so, of the succession of responding to a disturbance, um, the plants that are going to do that, may indeed involve plants that were uh, uh, that are novel to that space from before that weren't introduced. This doesn't mean if you see a plant that's just taken over this new space, that's what it's going to look like forever. It really isn't going to look like that forever, right? There's not there's not, old growth stands of wild mustard or star thistle or whatever, right? They're a stage, right? They're a stage. They do their thing, and then eventually something else, moves into the area. And them being there was part of prepping that territory, for that new thing. So, and especially at these early stages of these annuals, if you go in there and just rip them all up, okay, you just reset it. Okay, okay, now that's going to come back again or something like it. And if you just, a lot of times, the best thing to do is just hold off for a minute, right? Just watch, just wait, just see, because none of these stages are gonna last forever, and they're all doing their job. And in many cases, they might end up being beneficial for restoring some of the plants that were there before that you want to have there, again, right? So the invasive land ethic is one of sort of dominance and control, right? Here's how we want this to look. We're going to direct this in a top-down manner, right? Other kinds of land management would be looked at more in terms of these other species being first of all not below us, just different from us. We know the phrase all of our relations, for example, and reciprocity, right? So reciprocity as being at the heart of land management looks very different, you know. So reciprocity is harvesting from wild plants and then planting back, at the same time, always making sure that there's something there that's going. Reciprocity being that you're trying to provide for the other non-human, creatures who are there, whether it's insects or it's ungulates or predators or whatever the case might be, right? But always looking at things, trying to get this idea out of your head that this plant is bad, right? Oh, this plant is bad. It has to go, and once it's gone, things will be better. Well, it hasn't really worked out that way yet. People working on restoration projects have usually not been able to get rid of all of them. It's certainly not permanently. Sometimes if you spray a whole bunch, you can get rid of it for a little while, but you still haven't solved the underlying problem of what's going on underneath. So what caused that disturbance? Is it that the water is different because there's a dam upstream? Is it different because this was an agricultural field for several decades and it's been poisoned? Is it different because, I mean, there's going to be something there, a reason why this plant is there and not the plant that you prefer is there. And so you need to look at those conditions that are underneath and address those conditions. And when you address those conditions, then the plant that you don't like is no longer going to be at its home there. And then the plant that you do want is going to be more at home there. So that's really starting at the root of it, because we do know that just going in and pulling up a bunch of stuff willy-nilly or spraying it, this hasn't been working, and it's not going to work, and it might actually just be making things worse. So that's what I would say is the final word is to take a few steps back and try to see the bigger picture beyond just what you're viewing as this villain who's not a villain. They're just there doing their thing.
Fantastic. Yeah, I echo that wholeheartedly. That pretty much just summed up my entire understanding of invasive species and kind of how to respond to it, and probably how to respond to people as well.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about this.
Oh,
And
thank you, Amy. I really enjoyed it.
yeah, this has been really fun. And hopefully we can kind of keep this conversation going on Substack or elsewhere in the future. So yeah, thank
Mhm.
you.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really liked it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at kollibri.substack.com. That's kollibri.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.